Thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and thank you to EPSA for hosting this timely discussion on reliability. My name is Catherine Morehouse. I'm a reporter at POLITICO, where I cover the power grid and FERC. And I am so thrilled to be up here with this super distinguished panel today to talk about reliability across the country and in all different kinds of regions with different challenges. So I'll briefly introduce each of the panelists, and then we'll dive into some questions. So we have Gordon Van Welie, President and CEO of ISO New England. And we have Rich Dewey, President and CEO of the New York Independent System Operator. And Pablo Vegas, President and CEO of the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, or ERCOT. So thank you again so much to all of you for joining me up here. And I wanted to kind of start by jumping into questions specific to each of your regions, because as we've talked a bit about, there are just different reliability challenges based on different resource mixes, different policy drivers, and different geographical constraints and land use constraints, and those kinds of things that we'll get into. So Gordon, I want to start with you. We've talked a lot in the past, and you've certainly spoke about very publicly some of the problems that ISO New England has had in the winter months, in particular, securing resource adequacy. And you're also in a region where you have, I believe, 5 of the 6 states have ambitious clean energy goals. And so that creates its own set of challenges where you're both trying to secure resource adequacy while also moving very quickly to a different set of resources. So I know that you've kind of looked at a lot of different ways of achieving, again, both resource adequacy and this clean energy movement over the years. And I'm wondering if you can kind of give us an overview of where these efforts are now, and perhaps any proposals or steps you all have taken that you're particularly optimistic about.
Thanks very much. Good morning, everyone. So I was thinking about the question, and it struck me it's been 20 years that we've been struggling with energy adequacy issues in New England. I think it was January of 2004 when we had our first sort of surprise, when we had about 8 gigawatts of gas generators call in sick one Monday morning and say we don't have fuel. And so we've been struggling with that issue for 2 decades. But I'm going to skip over 18 years worth of history and focus on the last couple of years, because I think there's some interesting developments that make me feel optimistic about us sort of finally getting our arms around this. The first dimension to this is really analytics. So the last couple of years we've been focused very much on trying to come up with a probabilistic assessment tool for assessing energy adequacy. We labeled this the Probabilistic Energy Adequacy Tool, PEAT. And that has given us a much better analytical framework for assessing these risks, both in the near term and the long term. And we did this in partnership with EPRI, and I think it has led us to a conversation in the region about supplementing the resource adequacy standard with a regional energy adequacy standard. And that's a conversation that's playing out in some NERC forums as well. So that's one dimension to it. The other is we decided a couple of years ago to really invest in a new resource capacity accreditation methodology. That, I think, will be the first to finally implement a marginal accreditation methodology across all resources, including thermal resources. And I can tell you the part that's been the most difficult is actually developing the methodology for the thermal resources, for limited, for gas-only resources that have constraints, and then the other thermal resources as well. But along the way, it's also made us realize that we need to move to a seasonal capacity market. So we're just on the point of wanting to make a filing down at the FERC to delay our forward capacity auction another couple of years, so we can bring all these things together into a prompt seasonal capacity market that includes this new marginal accreditation methodology. So I think that will solve a big chunk of the problem, but I do have concerns about gas-electric coordination. We can come back to that later.
Sure, and we will. We'll get back to that. So, Rich, I want to turn to you, sticking with the Northeast a bit here for a second. Similar to a lot of the New England states, New York is under a clean energy mandate, and if I wrote this down right, it is to reach 70% renewables by 2030, emission-free electricity system by 2040, and a carbon-neutral economy by 2050. So I'm wondering if you could walk us through, what that looks like for you, and kind of what challenges and hurdles that presents to the ISO.
Yeah, no, it's and you did get those statistics right. I kind of drilled into my brain here. But when you think about the scope and the scale of the challenge, you got to think about where we're starting, right? So when the CLCPA got passed in 2019, we were 25% hydro, 25% nuclear, and really the rest was gas. Now we have a target of 70% renewables by 2030. So, and hydro counts in that, but nuclear doesn't. So when you think about the scope and scale of new resource introductions, it's gigantic. A big bet has been placed on offshore wind in New York, and we've seen some of the challenges that the offshore wind industry has faced and these are global challenges, it's not just New York problems, but the delays and the hurdles that have been created for offshore wind to be introduced has just made those goals that much more challenging. So I look at it from the standpoint of needing to create that balance, because in addition to the tremendous push and the incredible investment to build new renewables within New York is also equally tremendous pressure to retire the aging fossil fleet. And between emissions criteria from the DEC and some of the policy objectives of the governor, we're looking at tremendous pressure to retire the fossil units. And we look at this challenge really as a balance. I mean, we're going to need these units in place to manage the transition until the new supply is in place. And prematurely retiring these units really creates an imbalance on the system. We don't have that much of a surplus left in New York. We had 2 decades of really strong surplus that has slowly been winnowed away. We're almost down to the reliability criteria now. So prematurely retiring these units before we get the new supply online. And then our new problem, which is not a problem per se, it's actually really good news, is the economic development that's driving load growth is remarkable. And there's a number of new projects that represent lots of jobs, lots of new economic development in communities across upstate New York that for decades have been hammered by manufacturing leaving and going to other states. So now there's this great prospect of this new development, but it just makes those targets that much more difficult to hit. So we're faced with not only wanting to support the policy to assist in the removal of some of the dirty units that are in communities that have been under stress for decades, but also this is a great new job story. But we cannot rush to judgment on some of the retirements of these plants unless we're sure we've got the adequate supply in place. So that's essentially what's driving it. When you think about 2040, so 2040 is a carbon-free electric system. So when you think about the variability and the intermittency of wind and solar, what is that carbon-free replacement? And we've coined a phrase that I apologize in advance that we created that phrase, the DEFR. We didn't think it was going to go anywhere, and now everybody says it. But really thinking about the importance and the criticality of technology development to be able to hit these goals. And as we sit here today, we just don't really know what that technology mix is going to look like. So how do we create the right kind of incentives so that it can get developed and get introduced? And that's part of our long-range challenge.
Yeah, and we'll definitely want to talk about the load shifts as well later on. But Pablo, shifting to you, to the south and central. So ERCOT is coming off 2 consecutive record demand setting peak seasons, both during the winter and the summer seasons. I'm wondering if you could walk us through how these extremes in weather and demand have shifted the way you plan for seasons, if at all.
Yeah, thanks for that, Catherine. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Thanks to EPSA and to my fellow panelists. I'm excited to have this conversation today. A little bit about ERCOT first. So we are, we serve the majority of Texas, about 26 million customers, about 90% of the Texas grid. And we are an energy island, so we are not connected to the Eastern Interconnect or the Western Interconnect synchronously. So we are an energy island in that regard. We do have some DC connections. And you're right, we've had two extreme kind of weather peaking experiences. In this winter, we hit our winter peak of a little over 78,000 megawatts on January 16th. And then last year in mid-August, we hit our summer peak of over 85,000 megawatts, which was over 5,000 megawatts higher than the prior summer. So the peak-to-peak growth from one year to the next, almost 7%, which creates incredible challenges. In addition, what's a little bit unique about Texas is that we are an energy-only market. Meaning we do not have a capacity market where we have revenues for generator supply that are available in order to help ensure that we've got them when we need them at peak periods. So there's no capacity market revenues in Texas. It's energy only. So a resource gets paid when it's online and dispatching energy. And so that has its own market construct uniqueness that we have to work through. As we look through kind of the planning for these peak seasons, what we've realized, similar to what Gordon said, data analytics is becoming a really critical part of the story. And the complexities of the intermittency of the resources that are on the grid creates operational demands that have really surpassed a lot of the capabilities that we used to lean on over the last 20 years. And so we're coming up with new ways to try to understand and anticipate how the rapidly changing resource mix affects minute-by-minute operations. In Texas, on a day like a moderate day in the spring, we could have well over 50% of the energy being served in the entire state being delivered by renewable resources. And the ability for that to move up and down very quickly just with large cloud cover, a drop in wind production, and being able to respond to that has become a very unique challenge for us. In addition, on the load side, we're seeing a tremendous change in the types of loads that are coming into the grid as well. Loads that can change their consumption very quickly. Crypto mining is a really good example of that, where they move up and down with the price of energy, can turn on and turn off, and they're very large loads as well. So not only are we dealing with the intermittency on the supply side, like everybody else is, we're also seeing a lot of challenges on the load side. And so data analytics becomes a really important part about managing the grid in real time. We used to do a seasonal assessment of resource adequacy. So every season we would publish a set of probabilistic models to show under multiple scenarios. We do Monte Carlo analysis and say what we would expect in the summer season under normal conditions, under potential peak conditions, and then under some extreme conditions. And we would do that in each season. And typically your summer and your winter ones would show, your more extreme scarcity conditions and kind of what the probabilistic likelihood was of having adequate resources during those periods of time. We now have shifted this year, late last year and into this year, into doing those every month. Because there's so much changes that are happening throughout the year. The number of resources and the changes in resources is actually changing month to month in Texas. And so we need to have visibility into that every month in order to better plan the ancillary services, the operational needs, all the things that we're going to need to be able to communicate to keep the grid running reliably every day. We need to have more real-time information around that. And so data analytics is becoming a really key part of that. And overall, the challenge of trying to manage this incredible peak growth, not only on the peak side, but even on the base load side. Our base energy demand growth in Texas has been almost double the U.S. average over the last several years. And so with that fact, and with the fact that dispatchable generation with duration is not growing at the same pace as the base load, that also creates unique challenges. And so we're working to develop the models. We're working closely with our peers around the country. We're working closely with EPRI and other research institutions to try to figure out, how do we continue to operate a grid flexibly, reliably, with this kind of a rapidly changing resource mix. And we're just keeping up as we go through, each season and each period.
Interesting. And one thing that we talk about regional diversity, but one thing that I think has been something that several regions have experienced is this gas-electric coordination issue. ISO New England has obviously experienced this. Texas has experienced this. We've seen it in the Southeast and PJM throughout different seasons. And I'm curious to hear from all of you how you're approaching this regionally and whether you think that there is room or a place for the federal officials to step in, for whoever to step in on this issue.
Want me to go first?
Sure, go for it.
Sure. So, I said we've been working with this problem a long time. So I think we've squeezed a lot of the juice out of what's available in terms of gas-electric coordination. You heard me speak about the market improvements that we want to make, but I think that's not going to be enough to solve this problem. And the reason for that is that we're going to see this massive growth in electrical demand, and at the same time, we're going to see a retirement of a lot of the thermal resource on the system. So the balancing energy source is going to be natural gas. And all the studies we've done, studies I've looked at, show that the dynamic is the average demand for gas is going to drop because of all the renewables on the system, but the peak demand is going to spike up. So you have to ask yourself the question, how is the market going to solve that problem when there's such a different business model between the gas and the electric side? And so I think there's two major gaps. The first gap is analytics. So we're flying blind at the moment in the sense that we don't understand whether the gas system can actually support this growth that's coming from a peak demand perspective. And I don't see the gas industry stepping up to do this analysis. So in one corner of the world, we have the NPCC launching a study of the Northeast gas system, but really this problem is across the country, and I think somebody needs to be enabled to go off and do this analysis so we understand what's coming. The other problem is cost recovery. So, of course, the production side of the gas industry is merchant, but the pipeline, the transmission side of it is not. It's like transmission, except it's a different model. You need a counterparty that's going to take the long-term contract to build out that new infrastructure. And if you speak to the owners of merchant gas generation in the audience, they're looking at capacity factors dropping over the next several decades. So it's not economically rational for them to sign up for more pipeline infrastructure or more storage infrastructure. So, and the gas industry is not going to go out there and do this. So when I hear Chairman Phillips and Jim Robb say there needs to be more federal oversight, I agree with that notion because we have to solve these two problems. There are gaps that have to be addressed, and at the moment I don't see an obvious solution for it.
I think in New York, it's the two things that are a little bit different. One is from an operational standpoint, we've got a very high penetration of dual fuel backup, fuel capability, which allows us to ride through a lot of the operational reliability concerns when there's just no gas on the pipeline. That has been invaluable in riding through some of these supply events like Winter Storm Elliott. And we've approached it from an analytic standpoint as well, and it's really about understanding, and cooperation is desperately needed from the generators, and I'm happy to say we get great cooperation from the generators just to know what types of fuel do they have, what sort of commitments do they have, how much oil is in the tank, and we look at this as an operational model where we look 7 days out when an event is coming so that we can manage all this. That's not a great long-term solution when you start thinking about capacity expansion and load growth. The challenge that I see with the model that Gordon just described, and he's dead on, he's exactly right, is New York State has decided that they're getting out of the gas business, right? So this climate legislation is not an electric power sector challenge. It's an economy-wide approach where by 2050 it's going to be a carbon neutral economy. So the gas system in New York, when you start thinking about making those tough decisions about making investments into the infrastructure, making investments into the system, anybody that's going to be making that bet has got to be mindful of what the legislation actually targets today. And that's going to be a real challenge from a state policy perspective. I think that there is the opportunity, and we need to continue to work at sort of that federal state cooperation. I think there's a gap there. I don't have the silver bullet answer for how do we solve that gap, but I think we need to recognize that the investment signals that we send on the electric side don't naturally flow through to the gas side in a smooth way. And we've done a lot with capacity accreditation, really making sure that generators that are making that investment either in oil in the tank or have a firm fuel contract get adequately reimbursed for that, which they should, and that's a big part of tuning the markets. But in the long term, I think that there still is a gap there.
I guess what I'd add, and I'll announce it here today, something that's not too mind-blowing, but Texas is not getting out of the gas business. Texas is absolutely diving deep into the gas business. We're a little bit differently situated, clearly, than New York and New England. About 75% of our gas-fired electric power plants are served by pipelines that are under the jurisdiction of Texas primarily, intrastate pipelines, with the balance being interstate pipelines, and some of them have the ability to switch between each. So there's a little bit less of a federal oversight role in Texas around the operation of the gas pipelines. And obviously there's a lot of supply and production opportunities, and the ability to site pipelines and develop pipelines is not as challenging in Texas as it is in some of the other regions. The issue that Gordon brings up does apply, though, because the market economic challenges are the same. So if you're looking at a system that is going to be utilized on average less on a volumetric basis over time, but be needed more at its peak periods, how do you economically support that with a market design that incentivizes the generators to have the contracts, to have that gas available at those peak periods, the capital that's going to be invested in order to be able to grow that pipeline infrastructure to meet that growing peak capacity demand, and do it in such a way in a market where we're using less and less gas because of the consistent growth in renewables. So that's something that I think is going to be, we're going to have to work through that, I think, like every other region in the country does. On some of the shorter term challenges, I think we've done a few things that I think have really helped. And it was not too different than what Todd and Jim were talking about a little bit earlier, in that temporarily when we have events, those 15 days of the year, for us it's usually maybe 5 days of the year where there's going to be challenges with the gas system, the electric system, the coordination. We've got an organization called TERC in Texas. It's the Texas Energy Reliability Council. It's an association or it's a government created group that has the electric industry, the gas pipeline industry, the Texas Department of Emergency Management, the grid operators, the Public Utility Commission, all together. And when we have these events, we all get together and meet and work through what's going to be needed in terms of planning, preparation, operational issues. And that kind of coordination has really, I think, had an impact on the way we've been able to get through events like Winter Storm Heather this last winter, Winter Storm Elliott the year before. And that active real-time coordination makes a big difference for us. But the longer term issues from an economic point of view are still going to be challenging, and we're going to have to continue to work through that along with our peers here.
Catherine, could I chip in something else?
Of course, yeah.
So coming back to the analytics, I think it's the first step in order to solve the economic problem, because we're not going to have a productive conversation about how to pay for what's needed until we understand how big the problem is, what the gaps are, and where the gaps are. And what I'm struck by is we're having this big conversation about transmission, interregional transmission, regional transmission, and there's a requirement that we go off and study this. Congress has said to no, go off and study this. And yet there's this void when it comes to the gas industry. And so I think the ideal situation would be for the gas industry to stand somebody up to actually do this analytical work, to actually demonstrate what the problem looks like. In the absence of the gas industry doing that, I saw Jim here at the back, I think he's left by now, but I think NERC should do it. So somebody's got to do this work, and it has to be done holistically. And until we've understood what the gap is, we're not going to get around to figuring out how to solve this problem. The ISOs, I think, are going to march forward with creating products that create price signals. But the problem is, how do you take a spot market price signal and convert it into a long-term commitment to build out gas infrastructure? That's not clear to me how that gets done.
Yeah. And I want to talk a bit about the evolving resource mix, which is something that you're all seeing. As Pablo pointed out, maybe it's not all policy driven, but to some extent it might be economically driven. You're seeing older power plants getting pushed offline, mostly coal plants, some older gas plants, and at the same time, it's become really difficult to add new resources to the system because of transmission constraints and the lengthy interconnection queues and those issues. So this is kind of a two-part question, but I wanted to hear from each of you how the pace of retirements has shifted in your region, kind of how dramatically that's been for for each of you, and then whether, how much that problem could be solved by a more effective system of adding new resources, or whether that doesn't go all the way. Just curious on your thoughts on that.
So, unlike Texas, for example, we've not seen massive demand growth. That's primarily because in the last decade, the states have been investing tens of billions of dollars in behind-the-meter resource, both energy efficiency as well as solar PV. So what that's done is moderate demand growth. From a retirement perspective, we've seen a steady amount of retirements over time, but not a big sort of dramatic rush for the exits. So for now, we're good from a resource adequacy point of view. We've got energy adequacy issues in the longer term. But the big problem is going to be how do we deal with the swing that's coming, because electrification is going to drive massive demand for electricity. And it's also clear to us that we're unlikely to build any more thermal resources in New England or nuclear resource. So really the resource we're going to be dependent on is offshore wind, land-based wind, solar PV. Some of that can be helped along by transmission. And in some cases, there are big supply chain issues, as we know, with offshore wind. So we've got this sort of awkward hybrid market that's starting to develop, not only in New England, but elsewhere, where the economists, I've learned from the economists over time that there's two things that make markets not work well. The one is frictions, and we've got lots of those. And the other is not pricing the externalities in the market. And we've got that issue as well. We'll come back to that.
Yeah, I think in New York we've seen a lot of retirements. They've been policy-driven retirements, and it's been workable because we had such a surplus for so long in New York, and the retirements are the elimination of coal, closure of Indian Point, emissions reductions that have led to the retirement of a number of peaking plants in and around New York City. So we're down to the point now where we're pretty close to the reliability criteria. And I don't have any concerns about this winter, next winter, the next winter, but I have grave concerns about the winters of 2030, 2031, 2032. That's when we're going to need to see some of that new supply come online. The interconnection queue is a efficiency problem we need to solve, and we're committed to solving that. And we've actually, even before FERC Order 2023 gets implemented, we've seen tremendous improvements in the cycle time in New York, just with the process improvements that we put in. I'm not sure how much of that will result in new supply, because there's a lot of other factors and forces that are leading to projects getting stalled and not getting implemented. When you think about what's going on with offshore wind, a lot of the supply chain issues, interest rates, a lot of the barriers to the development of that industry, at least as far as New York and really the whole East Coast goes. So we'll solve the interconnection problem, but I'm not sure that there aren't other problems right behind that that are going to have to break free. Transmission continues to be critically important. We're approaching it in New York as the transmission infrastructure needs to be built, regardless of the date or the timing of when offshore wind is going to be built or when some of these new resources are going to come online. Building out the infrastructure is going to be critical. And we've been very successful, actually, with FERC Order 1000 and partnering with a lot of private non-incumbent transmission developers in Western New York, free up the hydro output of Niagara. The AC transmission project improved the Central East transmission. LS Power partnered with us on that. So that's been very successful. And now in Long Island and also in New York City, we're focusing on public policy transmission build out. And that's really just an enabling infrastructure that's going to be critical to smooth the new supply.
And in Texas, our retirement picture has really been much more economic driven, really not policy driven. When the Texas market deregulated in early 2000, we saw what we kind of expected to have happen, which is a lot of the older coal, older gas steam style plants were replaced and retired and replaced with newer combined cycles, much more efficient, much more potential to be successful in the market. And in the first 15 years of the market, first 12 years of the market, something like over 20,000 megawatts of net new thermal resources were brought online while there were a lot of retirements in those early years too. And then that really slowed as we started to see the growth of renewables. We've seen something on the order of over 45,000 megawatts of new renewables come online in the last 10 years or so, and only about 1,500 megawatts of net new thermal generation. And that trend is, continuing. We see that trend continuing going forward as well. And so for us, the economies of retirement right now are driven largely by the market economics, but there is potential for some of the new EPA rules that are out there, the clean air, the greenhouse gas rules, the carbon rules. Those could have a material effect on our existing fleet, and more concerningly, could really have a very chilling effect on future investments that are going to be critically needed, not only in Texas, but everywhere, I believe. So we're keeping a very close eye on that policy, and doing everything we can to try to work constructively with the EPA around that, because that's absolutely could become a very significant driver of economic closures of viable power plants earlier than they're needed. Our generation interconnection queue tells a very similar story. We have about 345,000 megawatts of expressed interest in development in Texas. Now, most of that doesn't get built, but out of that, over 80% of it is in two resource types, solar and batteries. About 150 gigs of solar and about 140 gigs of batteries that are in the queue. That leaves about 40 gigawatts for wind, and then about 16 gig of natural gas, which sounds very small. It's less than 5% of the total queue. But the good news is that that gas number, has doubled in the last year. And we believe that that's a direct result of some of the policy changes that have been enacted through the Texas state legislature, incentivizing the development of dispatchable resources in Texas, and recognizing that we're going to need to have a little bit more balance in the way that we see resources come onto the grid. But for right now, it's really a very strong economically based story as to what drives resources in and out of the market, and we're seeing these trends that we've seen over the last few years continue into the future.
Interesting. And this has kind of made me think about, well, Rich, to your point about just different challenges that resources face beyond the interconnection queue, and speaking about just the economic drivers of this transition as well. I feel like what I cover primarily is a lot of FERC and NRC getting their act together. We need to get all of this permitting right, and getting the licensing process right, and all of that. But I'm wondering, even if the regulatory system is perfect, are there still significant challenges to bringing these new nuclear plants online and new wind and solar online, and kind of, I guess, could you walk through the challenges beyond the perfect regulatory system of just in the market bringing some of these new resources online?
I mean, local opposition still continues to be obviously a concern, probably everywhere. New York has taken some steps to try to smooth the regulatory processes that remove some of those hurdles, and expedite the mechanics of what you go through to be able to get permitted and cited. But the policy oversight, the policy override is still a very deterministic factor in New York. When you think about the CLCPA, every agency is required to consider, in a siting and a permitting situation, how does this affect or impact the achievement of the CLCPA? And so that has been a challenge for a lot of projects. It continues to be a challenge, not only for permitting of new facilities, but even the extension or re-permitting of existing facilities. So it's a coordination effort between the FERC and the state in New York, anyway. That's really got to be smoothed out. And we sit in the middle as the ISO, and our job is to communicate the facts in an independent, truthful, honest, transparent way, so that policymakers can make the right decisions.
We're leaning into the nuclear potential down in Texas, because along with many other parts of the country, looking for dispatchable thermal resource adequacy that's clean and reliable. You have to be talking about nuclear in that conversation. And so the Governor Abbott created a task force in Texas that is being led by our Commissioner Jimmy Glotfelty. And we're working in a collaboration across higher education, various municipal governments throughout the state, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and a lot of the competitive power companies that all have experience in developing and operating nuclear plants in the U.S. Looking for what are the challenges to developing nuclear today, what are the barriers that we'd have to overcome, everything from siting to policy to regulation to workforce considerations, and of course the market. And so in Texas, one of the biggest challenges is going to be, can the market construct value the benefits that a nuclear facility could bring to the table in a way that would allow it to develop in a competitive economic way. So we really have, I think, an open road ahead of us to be able to move forward and to potentially advance nuclear technology. But again, the pace of being able to get the various technologies approved through the NRC process, it's not a short-term proposition. It's still 5 to 10 years probably at the shortest duration period. And so we need to be working on it today, recognizing that it takes that long. If we're not working on it today, it won't emerge in 5 to 10 years. So we have to really be pushing it hard now. And so there is an urgency behind that. But we have to think through what are going to be the other solutions as we go through time, because demand growth is going to continue to evolve. I'm sure at some point we'll talk about that explosive demand growth, what everybody's seen in terms of data centers and the potential for some of the clean energy manufacturing technologies that are starting to proliferate throughout the country. And that's creating pressures that can develop very quickly, much faster than the timetable to build power facilities.
Definitely. Anything to add?
Yeah, I'll come back to frictions and externalities. So the friction side of it is those are profound in New England, both in terms of building new infrastructure from a generation point of view, but also transmission, and there's many case studies out there. The other issue is that with regard to new build, given the limitations on what can be built in New England, a lot of what can be built is uneconomic and requires out-of-market support in some way. So that's the awkward hybrid I was referring to. So with the PPA structure essentially driving the offshore wind and also retaining some of the nuclear units in the region, that's going to make it much harder to make the marketplace work for retaining the balancing resources.
Yeah, and sticking with FERC and transmission for just a second here, obviously FERC is imminently, any month now, I hope, coming out with this new planning transmission rule cost allocation. I'm not sure how much that impacts you, would love to hear, but I'm curious what you're hoping for and kind of what would be helpful to your regions.
So of the two things FERC has done in the transmission space, I think the planning rule that's coming is more profound than the interconnection improvements. So the interconnection improvements are helpful, but we were already doing clustering studies in New England. The real issue is the lack of transmission for dealing with the new build that we need as well as the load growth that we have, because we had a successful run for about 15 years of investment in the transmission system to address reliability issues, and we pretty much eliminated congestion in the region. So that was a $12 billion investment, but the region stalled when it came to public policy investment because the states did not like the cost allocation rule that came out of Order 1000. So we've been working that issue together with the states and very deliberately giving them a role from a governance point of view in terms of overseeing the next stage of the build-out, which is really to satisfy the public policy goals. And we're close to finalizing some language as well as a cost allocation methodology around that. And so that I'm optimistic that that's going to give us a platform to start building out the system to meet the requirements of the future. The one sort of remaining stumbling block, though, is that the states are also very much focused on this issue of the fact that we have to upgrade the existing system, and the TOs have oversight over asset condition investments. So the ISO doesn't have any oversight. And there's been a call for sort of more prudency review around transmission. And so that's a gap that has to be addressed. It's not the ISO's role to do that. It's a regulatory function. FERC has recognized that that needs to be addressed. but there needs to be a solution there, because you need that together with cost allocation to get to a place where the states are going to be comfortable sort of letting things go and build out the system.
I think in New York, the situation's a little bit different. We've been a lot more successful with public policy transmission for Order 1000. Sometimes it's wonderful to be a single state ISO, and sometimes it's horrible. This was a case where it's been wonderful because we've been able to demonstrate really good cooperation with the state and done some, successfully completed some really important necessary projects. Where I look at the value of, and what I'm hoping to get out of the transmission order, the final order, the economic planning process in New York has been completely ineffective. So I think that there's opportunity to revisit that and think about transmission build, which would be economically driven, benefit consumers and also benefit the overall transmission of the electric system that we're looking to do transition. The other area is, this is coming at us so fast. You think about the reliability planning processes, it's more reactionary today, the way that it works. And I'm hoping that the order gives us some opportunity to think more proactively about future reliability concerns and allow us to work through transmission build opportunities that would enable us to get out ahead of some of the big problems that we see coming. So, like Gordon, I think this is going to be more valuable, more transformative than the interconnection reform, and I'm looking forward to an order other than the workload it's going to entail.
Yeah, and in Texas, it's kind of a whole different story, because since we are also a single state, but we're isolated, and so our ability to build transmission is driven pretty much primarily based on what the Public Utility Commission and the transmission operators work together along with ERCOT to plan out at what's needed. There has been some pretty significant changes recently. So historically, we would do regional planning studies, and we would only consider load that has been formally and financially committed to come onto the system through the transmission operator. And in doing that, we would always make sure that, the transmission that was built was very prudent. And so it was easily justified, when it went to the commission for support. In the last legislative session, they passed House Bill 5066, which effectively opened up the reins to be able to plan and to require us to plan load that is forecasted, not necessarily financially committed. And so when you look at the electrification trend that's going to be happening in our oil and gas sector in the Permian area of Texas, we saw coming in as a result of that from the transmission operators and from the industry a new set of load expectations that were far above what our historical plans anticipated for that area. And to put into context, just in the next 5-6 years in the Permian area, we saw new load forecasts upwards of 25 gigawatts in that area, which, to put that in comparison, that's like adding another whole Dallas-Fort Worth region of Texas to the state, or an entire coastal area that includes Houston into the state in the next 5 years. And only about half of that was actually oil and gas. The other half was data centers, hydrogen production, other clean air manufacturing type of functions. Crypto was a big part of that. And so all of a sudden we're seeing, with these forecasts coming in, this load explosion that potentially could show up, and we're going to have to develop transmission. So in Texas, to develop a transmission line, because we are all within the state, we can typically do it in 4 to 5 years. It takes about 12 to 18 months of studies on our part, and then about 3 or 4 years, on the construction side. And so in 4 to 5 years, you can typically build transmission capacity. Problem is that a lot of this supply and the electrification is going to happen much faster than that, and certainly faster than you can build the supply, the generating resources. So the big question is, okay, if we're going to add 25 gigawatts in the next 5 years, what's going to serve it? And so we're starting to have those conversations in terms of, how do you put together a transmission plan that doesn't have clarity on where generation is going to be going, has now a very different view on how load is coming into the picture, and that's a very unique challenge that we're going to be working through here, I'd say, in the next couple of years.
Yeah, and actually all three of you now have talked a bit about how demand pressures are changing, maybe not so much in New England, but you have kind of a unique investment that's solving for that, which is interesting in itself. And I'm wondering if you all could talk through a bit more just what are you looking at when you're seeing this demand coming in? What are you watching for, and how are you responding to those kinds of pressures?
Well, so I think the solving for the load growth on the other side of the meter is sort of a temporary windfall for New England. I think we've probably picked all the low-hanging fruit from an energy efficiency perspective, and there might be some more opportunity from a DR point of view. But with the shift into full electrification in the 2030s onwards, we're going to see a massive increase in electrical load. We're probably going to double our average demand and 2.5 to maybe 3 times on the winter. So we're going to move into a winter peaking system. So that's a pretty scary trajectory when you look out over the next 20, 25 years. And so dealing with that is going to be really complicated. We'll watch carefully what's happening in Texas to see whether we can learn anything from that. But the issue is going to be transmission to serve that need, and then where are the resources going to come from? Because if the region doesn't invest in both the resource and the transmission, we're not going to hit the decarbonization goals. We're not going to be able to support that load growth.
Yeah, I think I look at it as what really gets my attention is these very large loads driven by economic development, data centers, crypto. In New York, it's semiconductor manufacturing, where these are gigantic loads that can show up so quickly. Right? When you think about electrification of heating systems or transportation, you can kind of watch the trends, and it's a little bit more forecastable and predictable. Alarming in terms of the growth that we anticipate seeing, but it's more methodical. When you think about some of these large loads and the forecasting around how quickly they can come up, how big they are. I mean, there's a semiconductor plant that's planned for upstate New York that first couple of tranches is going to be about 1,000 megawatts, but now they're already saying it could be 2,000 megawatts, all right in one facility. I mean, that's like 2 nuclear power plants right next to each other. When you think about that, you also have to think about the opportunities that presents itself on the flexibility and the load side, right? And that's something that we absolutely got to be much better at, both in terms of incentivizing and also managing, is flexibility of load, because none of this transition is going to happen successfully unless we've got the flexibility of the load side.
Yeah, that's a really important point, because if large loads can come onto our systems and be considered, we call them controllable load resources, where they allow us to get real-time telemetry to their operations, and then in our market they can actually put in basically a strike price. Say, we will use energy up until this point, and then we will ramp down when the pricing gets to here, we'll ramp down when it gets to here, and we may come off completely if it gets to here. And with that kind of a connection point, significantly more load could come onto the transmission system, because essentially we can manage it safely and we can manage their operation. If they just come on as firm load, then it's a whole different story. Then we have to model and assume that they're going to be on all the time, regardless of what the price of energy is, and then that's where you can have stability or adequacy, constraints. I talked about the Permian, that forecast that we saw. In our large load, we consider anything over 75 megawatts to be a large load, and has to go through kind of a formal study process. We've got, in the last 2 years, 4.5 gigawatts of large loads that we've approved to come onto the system. If we look at 2024, we've got an additional 12 gigs that we've already, about half have been approved, and the other half are in active planning studies. And that number grows to 18 gig in 2025. This is just data centers. This is manufacturing. These are large loads, crypto miners, in the next couple of years that are going to have the ability to come onto the system. That controllability aspect is a critical side to that, and something that we'll have to look at. And one thing I wanted to bring up, just in the vein of the transmission conversation, because while the interconnection study and some of the conversation that's going on around the country with transmission, a lot of questions often come up. Why would or why wouldn't the Texas grid consider interconnecting interregionally to other parts of the U.S.? And there's been, I think, a little bit of misunderstanding on the perspectives, at least on the perspectives of ERCOT, that I want to be very clear about. We are not opposed to continuing to grow the connections between ERCOT and the other regions and the other grids in the United States. But there are a lot of issues that have to be addressed and questions answered in that consideration. And that's what I've been trying to be very clear about when we have these conversations. I'm not opposed to it. It certainly could provide reliability and resiliency benefits by doing so. But you have to look at what the total picture is. And that, by the total picture, I mean you got to look at the cost to develop it. So doing DC connections across regions is a very expensive transmission project. It's one of the most expensive to develop. When it's very sizable, it represents a unique risk point in the grid, and so you have to bolster the grid around it to be able to handle a contingency risk of that line going down. So if you were interchanging power between regions, and let's say it was 1,000 or 2,000 megawatt line, that would represent the largest single contingency in the Texas grid, which means that we have to have ancillary services and resource and transmission support to be able to not let the grid fail if that line were all of a sudden to stop transmitting power. So it's very expensive to bolster the grid around these very large power lines. And so that's one factor. It's costly to do so. The other thing is you got to look at what the real cost is to the customers on each side of that line. And so market dynamics and how pricing would work when energy is cheap in one area versus cheap in another, and what would be the real cost benefit or real cost transfer that would occur if we did more of those. That's something to look at. I think you also have to look at the reliability factors that go into why you would do this. If you're doing this in order to improve reliability and resiliency, the reality is that during a lot of these events, Winter Storm Uri type events, large regional events, the regions around us are experiencing similar conditions. And so the point in time where you might have built this facility when you need it the most, it may not be that helpful because the regions around are going through similar conditions. And so you have to factor that into the proposition and the economics. And then the last thing is, with kind of a unique market inside of ERCOT compared to the markets on the other side of us, SPP and NYISO, you have to look at the market dynamics and what is it going to mean for those that are considering building generation in the state of Texas if you've got these additional power lines. All of those factors need to be considered. That doesn't mean that it couldn't be the right answer and the right economic solution in order to improve reliability, but there's a lot of modeling and studying that has to go into doing that. And so we're definitely open to doing that work. We're open to the consideration around it. We just want to make sure that if we're going to solve for reliability and we're going to solve for resiliency, we want to do it in a way that benefits our stakeholders and our customers in a way that's economic as well as operationally beneficial.
Really interesting. Thank you. And just thinking a bit more about the scale of demand that we're talking about, the scale of load growth, and thinking about behind the meter, for instance, I'm wondering if there's a scenario where you have these massive data centers, the Amazons, the big money, investing more in behind the meter themselves and taking themselves off the grid if we're in a situation where things are getting tenuous and maybe it's more cost effective or just more secure for them to do that. I think we saw Amazon recently buy a nuclear power plant from Talon. Is that something that's a real possibility of some of these huge centers just making their own grid, going off grid?
Yeah, and I can tell you in Texas, we definitely see that trend happening, and it makes sense in a lot of ways because each company has their own kind of set of policies that they want to be able to comply with, whether how environmentally friendly they want their energy to be, what kind of an energy profile they want to have at that facility. And so being able to plan that with bringing some of the resources themselves into the grid, I think is a way that can help accelerate getting these resources connected potentially. But it can be a challenge because the ideal for these businesses is to have the flexibility of the best economic source for electricity as well as meeting their operational and their operating profiles. And so we have to be sure, we call them private use networks in Texas, PUNs, where we've got essentially load and supply behind a meter and some of it, all of it, being netted out. And that's something that's, I think, an important consideration in terms of long-term resource adequacy for a grid, is understanding that better. And then the other big thing to think about is making sure that the cost of the transmission to serve those resources is being adequately covered too, because there's a risk, and depending on how basically how the market works, you could avoid paying for some of the needed and critical transmission to serve those facilities and get power in and out of it, based on the way that that power netting can happen in those scenarios.
So there's an interesting little case study playing out in Connecticut right now. I would never have thought that anyone would want to build a data center in New England because the price of electricity is twice what it is anywhere else in the country. But 3 years ago, the state legislature created an incentive, a tax incentive, to host data centers. And so we have a developer wanting to co-locate at the Dominion-owned Millstone power plant in Connecticut. And it's started a huge debate because, of course, it's a 300 megawatt data center, and they want to put it on the site of the Millstone nuclear power plant, which will have implications in terms of the available supply for the rest of Connecticut and the region. So that's really why it's started a big debate. And replacement energy is likely on the margin to be gas, and so therefore there's a carbon emissions implication as well. So it sort of set up this big conversation about whether it's the right thing to do, and does the state want to proceed? And last I heard, I think they were steering it back to sort of studying this to figure out what they want to do with it. But it's definitely, even in New England, this is a conversation.
Yeah, well, and that's an interesting point too, because my follow-up question was going to be: is there, there's obviously a scenario where folks are building new stuff, but there's also a scenario where folks are taking stuff offline, and does that create a reliability challenge? Is that something? Are you seeing any more instances like that?
Yeah, we're seeing, there's a little bit of that in New York, and we get concerned about, number one, how do we make sure that the cost allocation is appropriate? And to Pablo's point, when that behind the meter private generation trips offline, how do you make sure, number one, you've got visibility and line of sight into that? From a reliability standpoint, the control of the power output comes into question in those types of configurations. So we worry about operational control and reliability. And then really just the transparency and visibility of where is it, what sort of net additions are happening, what sort of, and making sure that we've got the right kind of modeling in place so that when we think about our operational models and our reliability models that we get it right. So it definitely adds tremendous complexity.
Yeah, I was going to add that a lot of people think that we have a lot more visibility into things that we don't. We don't see every customer on the grid. Our modeling, our visibility is oftentimes limited to what we can see at a substation bus level. And so what's behind that, could be a private use network that has a very large load where we only see little peaks of that every now and then, but then if their facility goes down, they could become a 300-400 megawatt load on the system and all of a sudden just shows up. Yeah. So having that visibility is becoming more and more important, and it's a theme that we're talking about a lot more at ERCOT, is getting visibility to customers and to resources, not because we want to get into their business, but because there's such a dependency on what they do to the reliability of the grid day to day. And so if we can work together and have better information together, we'll be able to actually, I think, offer more flexibility to customers. I think offer even value to customers for those that are able to actually step up into kind of a controllable load situation, and enable the growth to continue more quickly because we'll have that better visibility.
You've been giving me really excellent transitions, because one of the things I've also been wondering over the past couple of months, when all of this, all of a sudden it feels like load growth is just staggering and is tripling, whatever, since more than what people knew. And from my perspective, I haven't really understood, why didn't we see this coming? Why is it all of a sudden all of these load growth centers, or all of these demand centers, and all of this stuff is coming online? We knew about electrification, we knew about some of these things. Why does it feel like this is such a big surprise to the industry and to the grid? And you started to answer that question, so if anyone else has any thoughts as well.
Yeah, I think it's like, the electrification of the transportation, the heating network. We know what heat pumps use, we know, what EVs use, and it's just figuring out what the adoption rate will be. So that's not that hard, really. But it's these very large loads, it's the data centers, it's the proliferation of artificial intelligence and crypto mining, that you can build them really quickly and you can stand them up really quickly. So from a standpoint of being able to forecast it and predict it, it does surprise you when it pops up. And a lot of it's incentive driven, in New York anyway. A lot of the subsidies that came out of some of the federal legislation that provided subsidies is incentivizing a lot of build of new facilities, and it's a race because they want to be able to capture those tax incentives. So they want to get it stood up and operational as quickly as possible. And until it's announced, you don't actually know that it's going to be there.
Yeah, I'd say it's an intersection between federal and state tax incentives that have been relatively recently created and the emergence of technologies. So, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, we weren't talking about AI as much as we are today. So I think that was probably the most surprising thing. If you want to go back 3 or 4 years and say, what did we not see back then? That, you would have to have said, what's the likelihood that we can have this massive stimulus that's going to really bring back onshoring of chip production and so forth, connected with the emergence of new technology that's very energy intensive.
In the last discussion that Todd had with Jim, they were talking about the amount of incremental energy that is used by artificial intelligence. And I've actually seen data stats that's even greater than what they were talking about, where a Google search uses 0.3 watts, is what I've understood. 0.3 watts every time you Google, where do I want to go to dinner tonight? But if you want Google AI to do it for you, it's 9 watts, which is 30 times the energy usage. And so I think what's happening right now is every one of the large technology companies are recognizing that AI is going to become embedded in virtually every facet of computing technology and software. And so they're starting to do that long-term, okay, what do I need to build for the future? And we're seeing these, hyper-scaled data centers being proposed because they know that the growth is, for the next maybe 3 years, they'd be fine with, the kind of a traditional growth profile. But if they're looking at 5 years and 10 years, they've got to grow for that. And that's what they're investing in today. So they're trying to get in front of it, as Todd talked about. Will we as an energy industry catch up and kind of get ahead of where the energy expansion is going? I hope so. I think we can, because I think we're starting to get a view through these changes that are happening on where things are going to be in 10 years. And so if we react to that today to the degree that we build out transmission to anticipate that we start to put together in place policies that really accelerate the coordination that's needed, I think we can get ahead of that and actually catch up to it. So I think that's what's really driving that pace of change.
Interesting. And so obviously we've talked through a lot of different challenges and changes in the power mix and in the load profiles and everything. And you all are operating under these market constructs, these systems with rules. And I'm wondering, if you had a magic wand, are there rules you would change to perhaps adjust the markets that formed several years ago now to maybe be more in line with the changes that we're seeing today?
I definitely would. I mean, when you think about these markets, we stood them up 20 years ago. They're all pretty similar. It was to solve very similar sets of problems, which are not today's problems, right? So it was desired and designed to introduce competition into a vertically integrated industry for the purposes of cost efficiency for consumers. And they've all done a really good job of that, quite honestly. They've incentivized the right kind of build, they've incentivized the right kind of behaviors, they save consumers a ton of money. But the objective now is not that. The objective is thinking about these environmental attributes, its emissions. The markets aren't set up to do that. And if you really want the markets to be the mechanism and the vehicle to achieve those policy objectives, you got to start thinking about pricing the environmental attributes in the market, whether that's a carbon price, whether that's other attributes. If you want the market to continue to perform and deliver the results that it has over the last 2 decades, very successfully, you want that to now bring you through into the future, which is a new objective. We've got to be able to price those attributes in the market. I think that's one thing that I wish we could do better.
Yeah, I'll reinforce that. So if we don't have carbon pricing at a realistic level, whether it's done economy-wide or whether it's done directly within the wholesale market, we're going to gradually create more and more of a dependence on the capacity markets, which are difficult administrative constructs, and greater reliance on other out-of-market measures, whether those be PPAs or ZECs or, dream up your out-of-market revenue stream. So I think that's a real problem coming at us fairly quickly. And so we've done this. We did a big study a couple of years ago called the Pathway Study. We looked at what the trajectory will look like in terms of energy market prices, and it's very clear what happens. I mean, we gradually take the revenue out of the energy market, and it has to come from somewhere else. So it's going to come from the capacity markets and these other out-of-market constructs, which is going to make the wholesale market design much, much more challenging. So we're kind of trapped in that reality at the moment. Really, we either need federal action or collective state action. The ISOs can't solve this problem. So we'll work around it as best we can, but it's going to make for a very difficult journey ahead.
The only thing I'd add, I think both Rich and Gordon covered this very well, is that when I think about the various attributes in a market construct where the benefits of reliability and resiliency have the economic value of all the other attributes that are being incentivized under current wholesale and markets today, I think that if I had a magic wand, I would kind of lean on that and say, let's find a way to create a consistent reliability revenue stream that would enable the growth that we're going to see in the coming years to be balanced. Because I feel like we're getting out of balance as a grid. And not recognizing that, we see a lot of the benefits, and we all see the benefits that the renewables are bringing to the table. We have to be able to meet the long-term resource expectations and the fundamental purpose of what we do in the industry, which is to support, behind air and water, electricity is the most important commodity to enable life today. And so it's not just about economic growth, it's not just about market pricing, it's fundamental, it has to be there, and the dependency on it is growing and growing every single year. The tolerance for it not being available is decreasing every single year. So we have to start to recognize that reality and say we need to find a way to value the reliability and resiliency of what we do in a way that enables balanced growth going forward. And I think that would be one of the most important changes I would try to enact.
And I think that that's something that the most near-term pressing need is to make sure that the markets that we have today appropriately value the reliability attributes that are going to be so important. Resiliency, I think there's a granularity that we continue to need to address, whether it's through ancillary service development, whether it's through making sure we get the accreditation right so that the types of performance that we really need from the fleet we have today is appropriately compensated and rewarded. And that's something that we continue to work on every day.
And it's a global problem.
It
so whatever label you want to put onto this, whether it be the capacity market label or the other reliability revenue stream label, everybody's trying to operate these markets within a political context, right? So whether it's Pablo in Texas or us up here in the Northeast, so that context is what allows more or fewer degrees of freedom with regard to solving this problem. But if you look around the world, this is not unique. This is a problem everywhere. And as far as I can see, no one has really completely solved this issue. And so I think we'll continue to work around the issues, come up with the best solutions we can. But it really comes back to the thing that Rich led off with. If we don't put more of the revenue back in the energy market, we're going to increase the complication of solving for this problem on the side.
Well, since we have some more time left, I get to ask my doom and gloom questions. So sorry in advance, but what keeps you up at night?
What keeps me up at night is the winter of 2032. And that's when our most recent projections, that's sort of the nexus between the load growth projections that we're seeing, the planned retirements from a policy objective that we know about, and I don't know what fills that gap in the winter of 2032. So that's, it feels like that's a long way away, but that's like tomorrow.
Yeah, I think the first world problems that we're experiencing with just tremendous growth, that's something that I'm always focused on right now. Making sure that our planning, keep adjusting our planning processes to keep up with the tremendous growth that we're seeing ahead of us is going to be something that's going to be a unique challenge for us in Texas. And similarly, I'm less concerned about the hot summers than maybe a couple of years ago because we've seen so much strong solar development and batteries are going to really help on those tail hours in the evenings. But the long, cold, dark winter storm continues to be a real risk for us based on our resource mix, and that's something that we have to always keep in front of us too.
So I agree with everything they've just said, and then I would add something to that, which is the pace at which we have to continue to evolve these markets. So, that's really something that worries me, which is we know there are lots of issues that have to be solved for, and we do not control the pace of the transition. It's happening.
Right.
And we're going to be running like crazy to try and stay with it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all so much. This was a really helpful discussion for me, and I hope for everyone here, so thank you.
Thank you.